He was born on a night when the air itself seemed to hum, as though some invisible thread was being plucked across the sky. People said the stars leaned closer that evening, tilting their quiet faces toward the earth, as though curious about him. He was just a child, but something about his presence lingered, soft yet unforgettable, like a half-remembered lullaby. His family did not speak of it openly, though in hushed moments his mother admitted that when she held him, she felt as if the world slowed down, breathing more gently for his sake. He grew slowly, as children do, but with a kind of thoughtful quietness that set him apart. Other children shouted and darted about, chasing one another in laughter and squabbles, but he lingered at the edges, eyes fixed on things no one else seemed to notice. The shifting shapes of clouds, the shadows cast by lanterns swaying in the night wind, the way silence seemed to contain its own secret voice. He did not need to be told he was different. He carried that knowledge quietly, as naturally as carrying the shape of his own hands. Yet he was not alone. His sister, older by only a few years, had a way of sitting beside him without needing explanations. She would lean against him while he traced invisible lines across the sky with his finger, and though she didn't see what he saw, she trusted the look in his eyes. Sometimes she asked what he was drawing in the air, and he would try to explain: stars shifting, dreams forming, paths unseen. She never fully understood, but she always listened, and in that act of listening, she gave him something more precious than comprehension. She gave him belonging. As he grew, the house seemed to bend around him, subtly shaped by his quietness. The evenings were gentler, meals slower, conversations softer when he was near. Neighbors sometimes remarked on the unusual calm in his presence, but his family never pressed for answers. They accepted it as they accepted the changing seasons, strange, unexplainable, but deeply real. And so his childhood unfolded like a slow, drifting river. Small, ordinary moments became layered with meaning. The way he hummed to himself before sleep, the sandwiches his sister made for him in the quiet of midnight, the lullabies his mother sang even when she thought no one was awake. These were the threads weaving the tapestry of his beginnings, fragile yet strong, each carrying a weight that would stretch far into the life waiting beyond the horizon. The first hints of his strangeness came not with thunder but with gentleness. One autumn afternoon, as leaves crumbled into gold across the yard, he stretched his hand toward a bird with a broken wing. The creature did not flee. Instead, it stayed, still and trembling, as though soothed by something invisible in the boy's touch. His sister saw this, and though her heart beat with wonder, she said nothing. For she knew, as he did, that this was not magic in the way stories tell it. It was something quieter, harder to name. It was tenderness given shape. And tenderness, once born, does not remain small. It grows, rippling outward, preparing for the days when the boy would leave the simplicity of childhood and step into a world that did not always know how to hold such softness. The sky on those nights seemed to hum again, as if reminding him that his path had only begun. Seasons passed as quietly as the boy himself, each year folding gently into the next, like pages of a book, worn soft at the edges. He carried his strangeness, as he carried his own shadow, never questioned, never denied. The broken-winged bird had long since flown again, but the memory of its trembling weight in his hand lingered like a secret promise. From that moment forward, he noticed more, the way withering flowers seemed to stand taller when he lingered beside them, the hush of frightened animals that stilled at his approach. No one taught him these things, and he never claimed them. He simply lived among them as if such occurrences were no more unusual than rain falling from the sky. His sister remained his closest witness. In the quiet hours after the lamps were dimmed, she would sit cross-legged at the edge of his bed while he traced constellations on the ceiling with his finger. He gave names to them that no astronomer had ever spoken, names that felt like lullabies whispered into the night. She sometimes laughed softly, not at him, but with the strange beauty of it, her laughter carrying no edge, only warmth. And in her laughter he felt something solid, an anchor that kept him from drifting too far into the strangeness that tugged at him from beyond the world. Outside their small home, life moved on in the steady rhythm of ordinary days. The village bustled with markets and quarrels, songs and sighs, yet the boy often felt it all as though from a distance, like listening to a melody through a wall. He tried, at times, to join in with the other children, running after them in dusty lanes, but inevitably he slowed, his gaze caught by the pattern of wind weaving through leaves or the way shadows bent and stretched under the late afternoon sun. The others would outpace him, leaving him behind without malice, and he would return to his own wandering thoughts, never quite lonely, but never quite belonging. It was his mother who first began to notice how these small oddities shaped the rhythm of their days. She found that arguments in the house dissolved faster when he was present, that her own worries seemed lighter when he rested his head against her arm. She spoke little of it, but in the quiet of her heart she wondered if his birth under that humming sky had bound him to something beyond their understanding. He was her son, flesh of her flesh, yet she sometimes felt he was also a guest from some gentler realm, passing through their lives like a soft breeze. The boy himself sensed none of this in words, only in feelings. He knew he saw what others did, but he did not carry it as pride or shame. To him the world was simply layered with extra threads of light and silence, threads he could tug gently but never truly unravel. When he walked through the village at dusk, he noticed how tired faces softened when they glanced at him, how even the stray dogs lay down more calmly at his passing. These were not triumphs or victories, they were moments, fleeting and fragile, yet deeply real. And so childhood deepened into something quieter, heavier, but still tender. His sister, growing taller and braver, began to tease him more, to test his patience, but always with that undercurrent of devotion. "You're strange," she would say, leaning her head on his shoulder, "but you're mine." He never answered with words, only with the steady calm of his presence, which she understood better than speech. The boy did not know it then, but these years of hushed gifts and silent bonds were not only shaping him, they were preparing him. Each small act of tenderness, each unnoticed ripple of calm, was leading him toward the wider, harsher world that waited beyond the village's borders. Already, in dreams, he sometimes felt the distant hum of other voices, strange and beckoning, as though calling him to step out from the quiet shelter of childhood. And when he woke, he would lie in the soft darkness, listening to the house breathe around him, wondering without fear what paths might open once he was old enough to walk them. The stars above him seemed to know. They shifted in slow, deliberate patterns, waiting patiently, as though the story had only just begun. As the boy's days lengthened into the quiet stretch of early adolescence, the village around him began to expect more of him, chores, errands, the steady learning of skills that would one day shape him into a man. He carried out these tasks dutifully, never complaining, though his mind often wandered far from the work at hand. While others chopped wood with quick, decisive strokes, he would pause to notice how the scent of pine lingered in the air, or how the dust of each splinter caught the light like tiny constellations breaking apart. These distractions might have made him seem careless, yet strangely his work was never truly neglected. Tools seemed to obey his slower rhythm, and even his pauses had a way of folding gently back into usefulness. It was during these years that he began to understand more clearly the weight of being different. Other boys teased him sometimes, though not cruelly, calling him dreamer, cloud watcher, half asleep. He bore their words without anger, smiling faintly, for he knew they were not wrong. He did dwell among clouds, both in sky and in thought, and the things that seemed distant to others often felt near to him. Yet every jest was softened by the fact that when disputes broke out among them, they instinctively sought his presence. A quarrel cooled faster if he lingered nearby, a fight dissolved more easily if his quiet voice cut through it. None of them admitted it, but they felt safer with him, even as they teased. His sister, too, was changing. Her childhood boldness gave way to a young woman's resolve, her teasing now tempered with a watchfulness that mirrored their mother's. She noticed how the villagers spoke of her brother, half in awe, half in unease. Though no harm was ever meant, she sensed the unspoken line growing between him and the rest of the world, a line she feared might one day leave him too far away to reach. On certain nights she held his hand as they walked home under lantern glow, as though her grip might tether him more securely to the earth. He himself remained untroubled. The world still unfolded to him in slow wonder, every detail worthy of attention, the way frost laced windows before dawn, the quiet hum in the air before summer storms, the faint rhythm of crickets syncing with his heartbeat. Yet beneath these moments of stillness, a stirring began, subtle but insistent. He started to dream more vividly. Sometimes he found himself walking through vast halls that echoed like seashells, sometimes drifting across endless fields where voices whispered his name from nowhere. Upon waking, he could never recall the words, only the feeling that he was being called to step beyond the small boundaries of his life. One morning, while helping his mother gather water from the well, he looked down at the dark surface and for the briefest instant saw not his own reflection, but 1,000 shifting faces, old, young, strange, familiar, all layered like ripples upon ripples. He blinked, and it was gone, replaced by the simple, calm image of a boy holding a bucket. He did not mention it, not even to his sister. Yet the memory stayed, circling quietly within him like a bird that refused to leave. The days pressed onward, each one carrying both the comfort of routine and the soft pull of something greater. The villagers began to remark more often on his calm presence, sometimes seeking him without realizing why. An old man asked him to sit by his bedside in illness, claiming the boy's company eased the pain more than medicine. A frightened child clung to him when lost in the market, soothed by his steady breath. These were small moments, easily forgotten by others, yet for him they were threads, weaving a pattern he did not yet fully understand. He began to sense that his life was not only his own, that he carried something meant to ripple outward. And though he did not yet know where this path would lead, the gentle humming in the night sky seemed to remind him he would not walk it alone. The stars waited patiently, as they always had, holding a place for him among their endless, quiet watch. The faces in the well stayed with him long after that morning, not as a vision to be explained, but as a quiet presence that lingered behind his thoughts. He began to notice reflections more often, in windows, in puddles after rain, in the sheen of polished wood. Sometimes they looked as they should, showing him plainly as a boy, with thoughtful eyes and hair falling over his brow. Other times there was a flicker, an expression he didn't remember making, or a shadow of someone standing just behind him when no one was there. These glimpses unsettled him, yet not in a way that bred fear. They carried with them a promise, as if the world was slowly revealing pieces of itself only when it sensed he was ready. His sister noticed the changes before anyone else. At supper, she would study him while he dipped bread into broth, watching how his gaze drifted beyond the table, how his silences lengthened. She teased less often now, sensing that the strangeness around him was deepening, becoming something neither of them could laugh away. Still, she stayed close. On nights when the dreams left him staring at the ceiling long after sleep should have taken him, she would slip into his room and sit nearby without a word, humming softly, as if to anchor him again to the world they shared. The villagers grew increasingly aware of him too. Their whispers shifted from casual curiosity to an unspoken reverence. People sought him for comfort in quiet ways. A grieving widow asked him to sit on her porch, saying nothing at all, only watching the dusk with her. A child who stuttered clung to him at market, finding ease in his patient listening. Even animals strayed near. Stray cats curled against his feet. Stray dogs followed him for blocks before wandering off again. He was not celebrated, not proclaimed, yet already his presence was shaping the fabric of lives around him. One evening, as lanterns were being lit, he wandered to the edge of the fields where the crops swayed in the late summer wind. The horizon glowed faintly with the last of the sun, and as he stood there, he felt it again, that humming presence, faint but steady, like the night sky itself was leaning closer. For the first time, he whispered aloud into the emptiness, not knowing if anyone or anything would hear. His voice was quiet, almost a sigh, asking nothing more than whether he was meant to keep walking this strange path. There was no answer, at least none that could be carried in words, but the wind shifted, warm and gentle, curling around him like an unseen hand. He took it as enough. In the days that followed, his dreams deepened. They were no longer scattered fragments, but long, winding journeys through vast places that felt both alien and familiar. He saw endless staircases leading into clouds, libraries with shelves of breathing books, rivers that glowed faintly as though carrying starlight instead of water. Each dream ended the same way, with the sense of being watched, not in menace, but in patient expectation. When he woke, he lay still, listening to the slow breath of his sleeping house, wondering how much longer it would be before the dreams reached into his waking life. His mother, though she never spoke of it openly, seemed to sense it too. She began to watch him with quiet unease, her love woven with a fear she did not confess. Mothers know when the world has claimed something of their children, and she could see it happening, little by little. She clutched his hand longer when he passed her things, lingered by his door in the evenings, as though reluctant to let him slip into the arms of sleep where she could not follow. He felt her worry but carried it gently, never denying her gestures, always returning them with a calm smile. And so the boy stood at the threshold of something vast, though he did not yet name it. His childhood was not finished, but already the weight of his difference was pressing against the edges of the life he had known. The stars, constant in their watch, shone with a steadiness that seemed to say, "Not yet, but soon." The faces in the well, the whispers in his dreams, the calm he gave to those around him, all were threads weaving together, pulling him toward the moment when his small, quiet life would open into something he could neither resist nor turn away from. The days that followed carried with them a quiet intensity, as though the air itself had learned to wait. He moved through his routines as he always had, fetching water, gathering firewood, listening to the rhythm of his sister's laughter echoing faintly from the yard. But beneath each simple act was the sense of something unfolding just beyond reach. The world had not changed, yet he felt it differently, as if every sound and shadow had been tuned to a finer note. Even the silence between words seemed heavier, layered with meanings he could not yet name. His dreams pressed deeper into him, refusing to remain as passing visions. One night he found himself standing within a great hall that stretched into infinity, its ceiling carved with constellations that shifted and breathed. The air was cool and full of a gentle hum, the same hum that had been present on the night of his birth. Figures appeared at the edges of the hall, blurred, indistinct, yet unmistakably watching him. He tried to speak, but no sound left his mouth. Instead, they seemed to answer without words, sending him the feeling of patience, of inevitability. He awoke before dawn, his chest tight with wonder, his hands trembling, as if he had carried something back with him. His sister noticed the change at once. She found him by the window that morning, eyes far away, as if he had not truly returned from wherever he had gone in sleep. She touched his shoulder gently, grounding him, and asked no questions. Her silence was her gift to him, the reassurance that he need not explain what he could not yet understand. He leaned against her without words, and in that closeness he felt the thin line that still bound him to the ordinary world. The villagers too began to sense that his presence was shifting. Some looked at him with gratitude, as though his calmness had become a quiet blessing they could draw upon in times of weariness. Others looked with unease, their eyes lingering longer than before, as if wondering whether to trust what they could not name. He never sought their attention, never claimed more than his share of space, but already his existence was being measured differently, half child, half something else. One evening, while walking home beneath a sky heavy with stars, he felt an unfamiliar pull, guiding his steps away from the path he knew. His feet carried him into the woods, where the air was cool and fragrant with pine. He did not question it, only followed, until he reached a small clearing bathed in silver light. There the shadows of the trees bent in peculiar ways, as though bowing toward him. He stood still, his breath shallow, and in that silence he felt it again, the presence that had hovered in his dreams. Not a voice, not a figure, but a weightless certainty. He was being prepared. He returned home late that night, his sister waiting at the door, her arms folded in quiet worry. She did not scold him, only searched his face as if trying to read what he had seen. He smiled faintly, though the weight of the moment lingered inside him too large to share. She let him pass without pressing, but her watchfulness grew sharper, as though she feared the day would come when he would not return at all. The days continued in their steady rhythm, but within him a shift had already taken root. The dreams, the reflections, the presence in the clearing, all pointed towards something that waited just beyond his reach. He carried it in silence, not out of secrecy, but because no words seemed wide enough to hold it. And as he lay awake at night, listening to the breath of his sleeping family, he knew, with a certainty as steady as the stars, the quiet boundaries of his life were beginning to dissolve, and soon the path ahead would open, whether he felt ready or not. The change within him deepened slowly, so subtly that even he sometimes wondered if he was imagining it. The world carried on in its familiar rhythm, yet each moment seemed edged with a quiet anticipation, like the pause before a note is struck. The villagers continued to greet him with the same half-curiosity, half-trust. His sister continued to shadow him with the same watchful devotion, but the space between his inner life and the outer world widened with each passing day. He began to feel as though he was walking on two paths at once, one of simple chores and familiar faces, and another that stretched beyond sight, drawn towards something vast and waiting. The dreams no longer left him untouched. They followed him into waking hours, not as visions, but as impressions that clung to his skin. He would be stacking wood when the air suddenly hummed faintly, just as it did in the dream halls of shifting constellations. He would fetch water and see, for the briefest instant, shapes moving across the surface of the well. He carried these moments quietly, telling no one. But each time he felt them, the certainty within him grew stronger. Whatever was reaching towards him was drawing closer. His sister sensed it without needing to be told. She began to stay near him more often, weaving her presence into his days like an anchor. When he wandered too far into silence, she would nudge him back with a remark or a laugh. At night, when the unease in her heart was strongest, she would hum soft melodies from their childhood, as though the sound itself could bind him more tightly to her world. He let her, grateful for her tethering, but even she could not keep away the growing pull that stirred in him like a tide. One evening, when the sky was bruised with twilight, and the lanterns were just beginning to glow in the village, he found himself standing again at the edge of the fields. The same clearing drew him, though this time he did not resist. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches bending in slow arcs, and he felt the air thicken with expectancy. He closed his eyes, listening, waiting, until a sensation washed over him. Not sound, not sight, but recognition. He belonged to something beyond this place, and it was waiting for him to take the first step toward it. When he returned home, his sister was waiting as before, her face tight with unspoken worry. He tried to reassure her with a smile, but she saw through it. "You're changing," she whispered, almost angrily, as though naming it might stop it from happening. He said nothing, because he had no words to soften the truth. She turned away, but later that night he felt her slip quietly into his room and sit near his bed, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Her silence said what words could not. She feared he was drifting somewhere she could not follow, yet she would not let go until she had to. That night his dream was different. He stood once more in the vast hall beneath constellations, but this time one of the blurred figures stepped forward. Though its face never clarified, he felt its gaze settle on him like a weight, a feeling, not a command, not a warning, but an invitation pressed into his chest. He woke before dawn, his breath shallow, his body trembling with the knowledge that something had shifted. The waiting was nearly over. The stars outside his windows seemed sharper than ever, each one steady and unblinking, as though holding him in their endless watch. He lay awake, the silence around him heavy, knowing that the life he had known was loosening its hold, and the path that had whispered to him in dreams was preparing to open fully. The air itself seemed to hum in agreement, quiet but undeniable, and he understood with absolute certainty that there was no turning back. Morning arrived, but it did not feel like other mornings. The light that spilled through the windows carried a strange clarity, as if the world itself had been sharpened overnight. Every sound seemed more deliberate. The clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the lower murmur of his mother's voice, even the sigh of the wind outside the house. He moved through the day as he always did, yet each motion felt weighted with significance, as though unseen eyes were watching, waiting for him to step fully into the role he had been quietly preparing for all his life. His sister studied him with an intensity that bordered on desperation. At breakfast, she watched his every gesture, her hands tightening around the cup she held. She spoke little, but he could feel her words unsaid, questions she did not dare voice, fears she could not quite shape. When he finally met her gaze, he offered a small smile, but it did not ease her heart. She knew as he did that something was drawing near, and she feared what it might take from her when it arrived. Later that day, he was sent to gather herbs for his mother from the edge of the woods. The path was familiar, one he had walked countless times, yet this time it seemed to stretch differently, winding in ways he did not remember. The trees bent overhead, their branches whispering together as if sharing secrets. The air grew still, the ordinary sounds of birds and insects fading, until silence wrapped around him like a cloak. And then he felt it again, the hum that had followed him since birth, no longer faint but steady, resonating in his chest like the echo of a hidden bell. He stopped in the clearing where he had stood before, the place where the trees bowed as though in reverence. This time, the pull was stronger, impossible to ignore. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his lids he saw the great hall of his dreams. The constellations above shifted, realigning, and once more a figure stepped forward. Its form was clearer now, still indistinct, but edged with light. And though it did not speak, he felt its intention press into him with unmistakable clarity. It was not demanding obedience, it was asking for acceptance. The choice was his, but the path would not wait forever. He opened his eyes to find the clearing unchanged, yet the world itself seemed altered. The shadows felt deeper, the light sharper, the air heavier with meaning. He knelt to gather the herbs, his hands steady though his heart raced. For the first time he felt the weight of what lay ahead, not as a distant dream but as something that was already unfolding. When he returned home, his sister met him at the door. She saw the change immediately and stepped back as if bracing herself. "It's begun, hasn't it?" she whispered, though she did not expect an answer. He only placed the herbs on the table and met her gaze, his silence confirming what she already knew. Her eyes filled with both fear and a fierce kind of loyalty, as though she had already decided she would not let him face whatever waited alone. That night, sleep came slowly. He lay awake, listening to the house breathe, to the faint rustle of his sister's movements in the next room, to the steady heartbeat of the world outside. When dreams finally claimed him, he did not resist. Once more he stood in the vast hall beneath shifting constellations, and this time the figure extended its hand. He did not yet take it, but neither did he turn away. Instead he simply stood there, trembling but resolute, aware that he was balanced on the edge of something that would change not only him, but everyone who had ever drawn close to his quiet light. The next day dawned with a stillness that seemed almost deliberate, as if the world were holding its breath. The boy moved through his tasks quietly, but every gesture felt altered, like a thread pulled taut inside him. His sister hovered near, her worry more visible now, though she disguised it with small acts, placing food at his side, brushing the dust from his shoulder, speaking lightly when her voice wanted to tremble. She did not ask questions, yet her silence carried more weight than words ever could. He felt the same pull in every corner of the day, a subtle guidance pressing at the edges of his awareness. While the others in the village bustled about their lives, bartering in the market, repairing tools, weaving baskets, he sensed something moving beneath their ordinary routines, like a river flowing unseen beneath the ground. The air itself seemed charged, not with fear, but with expectation, and though he said nothing of it, he knew the moment was approaching when he could no longer remain hidden in plain sight. That evening, after the sun had dropped behind the hills and the lanterns flickered to life, he found himself drawn once more to the clearing beyond the fields. He had not intended to go, yet his feet carried him there with a certainty he did not resist. The path was hushed, every leaf and branch bending inward as if watching. When he reached the circle of silvered grass, the air thickened, humming in rhythm with his breath. This time, he did not simply stand still. He stepped forward into the space as though answering a call that had always been meant for him. The vision came without warning. The world dissolved, and he was again inside the vast hall beneath living constellations. But where before the figures had remained indistinct, now one stood fully before him, draped in a cloak of shifting light. Its face was still veiled, but its presence radiated a warmth that reached into his chest, steadying his trembling heart. The figure lifted its hand again, not commanding but offering, and for the first time he felt what lay behind the gesture, not power, not glory, but responsibility. It was an invitation to carry something larger than himself, something that would shape not only his path, but the lives of those who walked near him. He did not yet take the hand. Instead, he lowered his gaze, feeling the weight of the choice press upon him. His mind flickered to his sister, to her laughter, her watchful eyes, the way she tethered him when the strangeness threatened to pull him too far away. He thought of his mother's quiet worry, of the villagers who leaned unknowingly on his calm. To accept would mean stepping further from them, perhaps beyond reach. To refuse would mean silencing the hum that had lived in him since birth. Both paths carried loss, but only one carried truth. When he opened his eyes again, the clearing was silent, the night deep around him. His hands were trembling, though his face was calm. He turned back toward the village, each step deliberate, the weight of the moment settling inside him like a stone dropped into still water. He knew the ripples would spread, whether he wished them to or not. His sister was waiting at the doorway when he returned, her eyes fixed on him as though she had seen the path he had walked without ever leaving home. She did not ask where he had been. She only reached for his hand, and he let her hold it. For a long while they stood there in silence, the cool night pressing gently around them. Neither spoke of what was coming, but both felt it, inevitable and near. The stars above glowed with their steady, patient watch, and in their silence he heard the faintest echo of the choice that awaited him. It was no longer a distant hum. It was here. Sleep that night did not come easily. He lay awake, listening to the rhythm of his sister's breathing through the thin wall, and to the subtle creaks of the house as it settled into silence. The choice he had been offered in the clearing pulsed through him, a steady thrum that would not let him rest. When his eyes finally closed, it was not into ordinary dreams, but into a deeper vision, one that felt less imagined and more remembered, as if he were stepping into something that had always belonged to him. The hall returned, vast and unending, its ceiling alive with constellations that shifted like tides. This time he did not hesitate at the threshold. He walked forward, and the air thickened, warm and luminous. The cloaked figure waited, hand still extended, patient and unyielding. Around it, other presences lingered, shadows watching from the edges, silent and expectant. Their stillness carried weight, as if they had been waiting for this moment far longer than he had lived. He reached out, not fully, but enough to let his fingertips brush against the offered hand. A current rushed through him, neither pain nor joy, but recognition, like finding the missing half of a song he had been humming all his life. Images flooded his mind, rivers of light stretching into endless darkness, faces layered through time, the tender ache of lives he had not lived yet somehow carried within him. It was overwhelming, and he staggered back, gasping, his chest heavy with the enormity of what he had touched. Yet even in his trembling, a clarity formed. The path was real, and it had already claimed him. When he woke, the room was still dark, his skin damp with sweat. His sister stirred lightly, sensing his unrest even in her sleep. He rose quietly, stepping outside into the cool night. The stars above were steady and sharp, their gaze unflinching. For the first time, he did not look at them as a boy dreaming of mysteries beyond reach. He looked at them as one who had been invited into their silence. The following days carried a quiet shift. Though nothing outwardly changed, the villagers sensed something different in him. They lingered near him longer, asked him for small favors without naming why. An anxious mother pressed her infant into his arms, whispering that the child slept easier there than in her own. An old man gripped his hand, thanking him with tears in his eyes, though no words had been exchanged. These were not miracles, not powers in the way tales described them, but they were signs, ripples spreading from the stone that had been cast into his life. His sister noticed most of all. She spoke less now, as if words would shatter the fragile balance they lived within. But her eyes followed him with fierce loyalty, and at times she reached for his hand with sudden urgency, as though reminding him that he was still hers, still bound to the life they had built together. He never pulled away. He held on, knowing that each gesture mattered more than she could admit. And yet, each night, the hum grew louder, pulling him back toward the clearing, back toward the hall of constellations. He resisted for as long as he could, but the weight of inevitability pressed harder with each passing day. It was not a matter of if, but when. He began to feel the truth settle inside him. The boy he had been was fading, and the life ahead was no longer a question of choice but of readiness. The stars, unblinking in their patient watch, seemed to wait for him to decide. And though fear lingered, there was no longer room for denial. The path had opened, and sooner than he wished, he would have to step fully into it. The nights that followed pressed heavier against him, not in menace but in insistence, as though the world itself leaned closer, urging him to move forward. He no longer dreamed as a boy. The visions carried the weight of memory, ancient and patient, filling him with truths too large to hold yet impossible to ignore. Each time he closed his eyes, he found himself standing within that vast hall of living constellations, the figure waiting with unwavering calm, the others watching silently from the shadows. The invitation remained, and though he had brushed against it once, the choice still hung between them like a breath not yet released. By day, he carried the burden of these nights in quiet silence. The villagers noticed a stillness in him that was different now, not merely the calm of a boy who lingered on clouds and shadows, but a presence that reached deeper. People sought him without realizing why. A man whose hands shook from grief found steadiness sitting beside him. A child who had cried through the night finally slept when the boy hummed softly under his breath. These were small, unremarkable acts to any who might look from afar, yet those who received them felt a kind of peace they could not explain. They began to whisper of him more often now, voices hushed not from suspicion, but from reverence, as though speaking his name too loudly might break whatever delicate thread he carried. His sister grew more restless with each passing day. She lingered by his side whenever she could, watching the way others leaned unconsciously toward him, how even silence seemed to bend differently when he was present. Her fear sharpened not of him, but of what might take him away. She held his hand more tightly, as if her touch could root him to the earth. And though he always let her, he felt the truth pressing quietly between them. There were places he was being called to that she could not follow, no matter how tightly she held on. One evening, when the sky burned deep orange at the horizon and shadows stretched long across the fields, the pull grew undeniable. He left the house with steady steps, knowing his sister's eyes followed him from the doorway. The path to the clearing felt shorter than before, as if the forest itself was guiding him forward. The air there was thick, humming with the same rhythm that had lived in him since birth, now rising into a steady chorus. He stood at the center, heart pounding, and closed his eyes. The hall returned instantly. This time there was no drifting, no slow unfolding. The constellations surged above him, brighter than ever, their patterns shifting as though marking his arrival. The cloaked figure stepped forward again, its hand outstretched, but now the gesture carried urgency. Around them, the watching presences leaned closer, the air vibrating with expectation. He felt the choice thrum within him, not an order, not a demand, but the truth of what had always been waiting. He reached out once more, his hand trembling, but unhesitating. When his fingers touched the figures, the current that rushed through him was no longer a whisper, but a flood. Images cascaded over him, lives layered upon lives, threads of light weaving across endless spans of time, the ache of countless memories carried like echoes within him. He gasped, but did not pull back. He let it fill him, even as it burned, even as it shook him to his core. When he opened his eyes again, the clearing was silent, the night air cool against his skin. Yet he knew he had not returned unchanged. Something had been set into motion, and there was no returning to the boy he had been. The hum within him was no longer distant. It beat in his chest, steady and sure, like a second heartbeat. He walked back toward the village, each step heavy with the weight of what had passed. His sister was waiting, as she always was, her face pale in the lantern glow. When she saw him, she knew without asking. She reached for him, and he let her, though he felt the space between them widening, not from distance, but from the path that now stretched ahead. For the first time, he felt the truth settle completely inside him. He had stepped into the beginning of something vast, and the life he had known was already slipping behind him like a fading shadow. The days that followed were veiled in a quiet strangeness, as if the world itself had taken notice of the shift within him. Nothing outward seemed different. He still walked the same paths, spoke the same gentle words, carried the same calm. But beneath it all there was an undercurrent, steady and undeniable, like the low resonance of a drum that no one could see, yet all could feel. The villagers leaned closer when he passed, their eyes lingering with unspoken questions, their steps slowing as though unconsciously drawn to the space around him. What had once been faint curiosity was now reverence, tinged with unease, and though no one dared voice it, they sensed he was no longer fully theirs. His sister felt it most. Each evening she sat with him, her silence sharp, her gaze fierce, as though she could anchor him through sheer force of will. He let her because her presence reminded him of who he had been before the clearing, before the visions, before the weight pressed into his chest like a second heartbeat. But he also knew she was beginning to see what he could no longer hide, that a path had opened and it was pulling him forward regardless of how tightly she held on. One night, unable to bear the heaviness in her chest, she finally spoke. Her words trembled, though her voice was steady. "You're slipping away from me." He looked at her for a long while, then placed his hand over hers. His calm did not erase her fear, but it softened it, reminding her that even if the distance grew, the bond between them would not break. She turned her face away, unwilling to let him see her tears, but she held his hand until her grip hurt, refusing to loosen even as sleep crept over her. The hum inside him grew stronger with each passing night, its rhythm aligning with his breath, until he could not tell where it ended and he began. Dreams no longer felt separate from waking life. The hall of constellations lived within him, rising and falling with the beat of his heart. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes even for a moment, he saw flashes of the figure cloaked in light, its hand still extended, its silent invitation still unwavering. Other times he saw the faces from the well, layered and shifting, watching with the patience of ages. One evening, as he sat at the edge of the fields, the sky washed in fading silver, he realized with sudden clarity that he was no longer waiting. Whatever lay ahead had already begun, and all that remained was for him to step fully into it. The thought filled him with both awe and sorrow, wonder at the vastness opening before him, and grief for the simplicity he would leave behind. He thought of the laughter of children in the village lanes, of his mother humming softly while cooking, of his sister's quiet songs in the dark. These were moments he would carry, but he knew he could not return to them unchanged. That night, the vision came more vividly than ever before. The hall stretched endlessly, constellations blazing with a brilliance that almost blinded him. The cloaked figure stood close, and behind it the others leaned forward, their silence thrumming with urgency. He stepped forward, his heart steady, and for the first time he did not hesitate. He reached for the hand, and when he grasped it fully, the flood returned, not as chaos this time, but as clarity. He saw lives unfolding like threads of light, each connected, each carrying echoes of kindness, grief, love, and loss. He saw how small acts rippled outward, how tenderness could alter the course of things unseen. The weight was immense, but it did not crush him. It settled into him instead, merging with the hum he had carried all his life, until the two were indistinguishable. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer just a boy standing in the clearing. He was something more, not distant, not unrecognizable, but fuller, as though the strangeness within him had finally taken shape. The stars above the village burned brighter than he had ever seen, their light steady and unwavering. He stood beneath them, breathing slowly, and though the path ahead was still hidden, he knew there was no turning back. The beginning had already passed. What lay before him was the becoming. The morning after the vision, the boy rose before the sun, though it felt as if he had not slept at all. His body moved as it always had, but inside he carried the weight of something newly awakened, something that pulsed with quiet certainty. When he stepped outside, the world appeared both familiar and altered. The fields were still heavy with dew, the houses still exhaled smoke from their chimneys, yet every sound seemed sharpened, every color deeper, as if the world had finally revealed its true face. He walked among the villagers that day with the same gentleness he had always shown, but their eyes lingered differently now. They could not name what they saw, but they felt it, an undeniable shift that made their voices soften when they spoke to him, made their steps slow as they passed him by. An old woman clasped his hands as if she had been waiting for him her entire life, though she had known him since infancy. A young boy followed him down the lane without saying a word, as though drawn to the calm that radiated from him. None of this surprised him anymore. He understood now that his presence had become more than his own. It was carrying something larger, something that flowed through him into the lives of others. His sister did not try to hide her worry. She moved closer than ever, almost unwilling to leave his side, as if the world might snatch him away if she let go. That evening, she confronted him, her voice breaking despite her effort to hold it steady. "You're not the same anymore," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "And I don't know if I can follow where you're going." He looked at her then with a tenderness deeper than words, and though he could not promise her that he would remain unchanged, he offered her what he could, a presence steady as the stars, a reassurance that no distance could sever what had been woven between them. She cried quietly, leaning against him, and he let her tears soak into his sleeve without pulling away. That night, when he lay down to rest, he did not resist the pull of the dreams. The hall came to him at once, vaster than ever, its constellations burning brighter, their patterns shifting as though aligning to his presence. The cloaked figure no longer needed to extend its hand, he had already accepted. Instead, it stepped aside, revealing the endless space beyond, and for the first time he understood the hall was not a place to remain, but a threshold. What waited past it was not comfort, but purpose. He walked forward into the light, and as he did, he carried with him the echoes of his small life, the warmth of his mother's lullabies, the weight of his sister's hand in his, the laughter of children in dusty lanes, the stillness of the bird with the broken wing. These memories did not bind him, they steadied him, reminders of why the path mattered at all. The current of light swept around him, filling him not with power, but with the quiet truth that what he had always carried, his calm, his tenderness, was never small. It was the very thing he had been chosen for. When he opened his eyes again, the stars above the village seemed impossibly close, their glow steady and protective. He stood beneath them, the hum in his chest no longer strange but familiar, as natural as breathing. He was still himself, still the boy who had traced constellations on the ceiling, who had listened more than he spoke, who had held broken things until they healed, but now he knew. He was part of something that stretched far beyond the edges of the life he had known. The night held him in its quiet embrace, neither rushing nor delaying what was to come. And as he breathed, steady and calm, he understood that the journey had only just begun, though the boy he once was had already become something more. The stars, patient and watchful, bore silent witness, their light a promise that he would never walk alone, no matter how far the path carried him from home. The days that followed passed with an uncanny quiet, as though the village itself sensed the turning of something invisible. Life went on. Fields were tilled, markets filled with chatter, children chased one another through dusty streets, but beneath the familiar rhythm lay an undercurrent, subtle yet unshakable. The boy moved among them as he always had, offering a steady smile, lending his calm presence. Yet everywhere he went, eyes followed. They no longer saw him simply as the quiet dreamer. They felt something deeper, stirring in him, though none could name it. Some looked with gratitude, others with unease, but all knew they stood in the presence of a change too vast to ignore. His sister never left him for long. She had grown sharper in her silence, as though every breath he took might be his last within her reach. At night she lingered near his room, sometimes sitting by the doorway until sleep overcame her. She did not ask where his steps might lead, but the fear was written in her every gesture, the fear that one morning she would wake to find him gone, pulled into the path that had been waiting for him all along. He noticed her struggle and carried it tenderly, offering her his steadiness whenever she faltered, though he knew such comfort was fleeting. What pressed upon him could not be delayed forever. It was during one of those quiet evenings, while the horizon burned faintly with twilight, that the pull became undeniable. The hum within him had grown constant, woven so deeply into his heartbeat that he no longer felt separate from it. He knew the moment had come when the threshold between vision and waking would blur beyond return. He rose from the house without speaking, his steps guided by something older than choice. His sister watched from the doorway, her hand pressed to her chest, torn between holding him back and letting him go. In the end, she did neither. She simply whispered his name into the fading light, and he carried it with him like a thread, tying him to home. The clearing awaited him, silvered in moonlight. This time it did not feel like a place apart from the world, but like the very heart of it, pulsing with the same rhythm that lived inside him. The air trembled with anticipation, branches bowing as though in reverence. He stepped into the center, and the vision unfolded instantly. The hall of constellations stretched before him once more, no longer distant, but alive with brilliance, its patterns shifting as if acknowledging his arrival. The cloaked figure was waiting, though its form shimmered now, dissolving into the vast expanse of light behind it. It had been only a guide, he realized, a hand leading him to the threshold. What lay beyond was his alone to walk. He stepped forward, and the flood returned, not as chaos, but as understanding. He saw threads of countless lives woven together, each small act of kindness and sorrow binding them into something greater. He saw how his own quiet presence had rippled outward, touching lives in ways he had never imagined. The truth pressed into him. His gift was not meant to remain hidden in a small village or sheltered within childhood. It was meant to be carried outward to places unseen, where silence and tenderness were needed most. When he opened his eyes, the clearing lay around him, but he no longer felt like a boy standing within it. The hum within him was steady, full, no longer a whisper, but a voice that would not fade. He breathed deeply, and the night seemed to breathe with him, stars bending closer, as if to bear witness. He turned toward the village, his steps, deliberate, knowing each one drew him closer to the moment when he would have to leave it behind. And though the thought ached in him, he felt no fear. For the memories of his sister's hand, his mother's lullabies, the quiet laughter of children, and the gentle weight of every kindness he had carried, these would remain with him, threads woven into the fabric of who he was. The journey ahead was vast, but he would not walk it empty. He would walk it with all of them inside him, a light steady enough to guide him through whatever waited beyond the horizon. The following morning began not with a burst of change, but with the same slow quiet he had always known. The sky was pale with early light, and mist clung to the ground like breath not yet spoken. Birds called softly in the trees, and the village stirred gently from its sleep. But inside him, everything had shifted. The rhythm of the world was no longer something he walked beside. It was something he carried now, like a current beneath the surface of his thoughts, shaping each movement with a purpose he had only just begun to understand. He moved through the house as he always did, careful with each sound, letting the peace of the morning remain untouched. His mother had already risen and was at the stove, humming under her breath, her hands busy in the way they had always been. He stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her, memorizing the curve of her shoulders, the way the light caught in her hair. He didn't speak, not because there was nothing to say, but because every word he could offer would only scratch the surface of what pulsed in his chest. When she turned and saw him, her face softened, and for a moment her eyes brimmed with something that looked like understanding. She didn't ask questions, she only nodded once, slowly, and returned to her work, her hum carrying on as if to tell him, "I know you're going, and I'm still here." His sister met him outside, her arms crossed against the early chill, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak either, not right away. They stood in the courtyard, the sky slowly brightening above them, the village behind them still half asleep. She looked at him the way someone looks at the sea for the last time before turning inland. Then she reached out and adjusted the collar of his shirt, smoothing it down with a gesture so familiar it broke something inside him. "I won't ask you to stay," she said finally, her voice steady but low. "But you'd better come back. One day. I mean it." He nodded, unable to speak, and she pulled him into a hug that held all the weight of their shared years. When she let go, it felt like something being unstitched, not torn, but carefully, painfully opened. He stepped back, and she didn't follow. He didn't expect her to. Some paths must be walked alone, and this was one of them. He passed through the village, slowly, allowing himself to feel each moment, the smell of bread baking, the creak of shutters opening, the soft voices of neighbors beginning their day. Faces turned toward him as he walked, and though no one spoke, they all watched. Some offered faint nods, others simply held his gaze. They knew something was ending, though they didn't know what. And perhaps, in the way of all quiet things, that was enough. The road beyond the village stretched ahead, framed by trees and the whisper of wind through tall grass. It had always been there, waiting, but now it shimmered with something else. Recognition, maybe, or welcome. He took one last look behind him, not to question the path, but to honor what he was carrying with him. Then he turned forward and began to walk, his step steady, the hum inside him no longer calling from a distance, but singing softly from within. Each footfall felt like a thread being woven into something larger, and though he could not yet see the shape of it, he trusted it would hold. The sky above warmed with morning light, and the world opened before him, not with fanfare, not with noise, but with the kind of deep, slow unfolding that only the patient can feel. He walked on, not as a boy drawn by mystery, but as someone who had already heard the truth and chosen to answer it. The road welcomed him not as a stranger, but as one who had always belonged. The path wound gently through the trees, familiar in shape but not in feeling. He had walked this way before, once as a child chasing after a lost kite, another time with his sister beside him, pockets full of stones and questions, but now the same bends and roots and moss-covered stones carried a different weight. He saw everything as if lit from within, the curve of bark, the glimmer of dew clinging to grass, the shadows shifting softly beneath leaves. Nothing had changed, and yet it all felt like it had been waiting, somehow holding its breath until he returned, not as a boy wandering, but as one finally answering. He didn't know where the road led, that was part of it, part of what had always stirred beneath his days like an unspoken name. The clarity he now carried wasn't direction, but readiness. It was not a map, but a hum, the same low thread that had followed him through dreams, through clearing and vision and silence. It didn't need to tell him where, it only needed him to keep walking. The forest opened now and then into wide meadows, the grass tall and swaying with the breath of morning. Birds followed him, not in flocks, but in ones and twos, circling, then darting off again, as if checking in on him from time to time. A fox crossed his path and paused, watching him with calm, unreadable eyes before disappearing into the brush. Everything felt like it was part of a quiet language he was only beginning to understand, not words, but patterns, gestures, rhythms. It wasn't that the world had changed for him, it was that he had finally slowed enough to hear it speaking. By midday, the sun filtered high and warm through the canopy, and he paused beside a stream, letting his hands drift through the water. It felt different than the well back home, not colder, not cleaner, just more awake, as though it recognized him. He stayed there for a long while, not thinking, not planning, simply letting the silence stretch wide around him. There was a strange peace in not knowing what would come next. He wasn't in search of answers. He was only listening for the next moment to rise. That night he slept beneath a hollowed tree, curled beside its roots, the stars above framed by branches like reaching fingers. He dreamed again, not of the hall but of the village. He saw his sister sitting at the edge of their roof, watching the sky with a quiet stubbornness that only he could understand. She wasn't calling for him, wasn't asking him to return, but she was there, steady and still, and that was enough. He woke with tears dried on his face, not from sorrow, but from the strange ache of love that refuses to fade even in absence. He walked again at dawn, and the path changed, not dramatically, but subtly. The air grew crisper, the trees taller, the wind softer. He began to see signs he didn't recognize, markings on stones, circles in moss, little arrangements of twigs and petals that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. He bent to examine one, 4 tiny feathers arranged around a pine cone, and felt a faint tug in his chest, as though someone had left it for him, not to guide, but to acknowledge. He was being watched, not in fear, not with malice, only with the gaze of those who wait until a threshold is crossed before stepping forward. He felt it the way animals feel weather, the way children sense when someone is behind them. And yet it didn't unnerve him. It made him feel seen in a way he never had before. Whatever he was approaching had already been watching him grow, and now that he was coming near, it stirred softly, gently, without rushing. He kept walking, the hum in his chest now matched by a hush in the world around him, as if the forest itself was leaning in, waiting to see what he would do next. And he knew, in the marrow of him, that the moment of meeting was close. Not a climax, not an ending, but a meeting between who he had always been and what had always been waiting. The path narrowed as he moved deeper into the forest, the trees thickening overhead until the sky became a flicker of light through layers of green. The sound of the world softened. No birdsong, no rustling underbrush, just the quiet breath of the woods. He felt it change around him, not with suddenness but with intention, as if the forest were folding inward, drawing him toward something it had hidden for a long time. He walked more slowly now, not from hesitation but reverence. Every root beneath his feet felt placed, every step welcomed. The markings he'd begun to notice the day before appeared more frequently. Feathers balanced on stones, strings of bark knotted into the low, branches, even small, smooth circles cleared into the earth as if something had sat there, waiting. They were not warnings, they were invitations. The hum in his chest grew louder, not painful, but full. It had been a whisper his whole life, then a rhythm, and now it was a kind of knowing, a resonance between him and the space he was entering. He could feel that he was no longer walking into the unknown, but into something that already knew him. By the time he reached the glade, the light had shifted. It wasn't brighter, only different, softer, more deliberate, like it had been filtered through memory. The clearing was small, quiet, ringed by trees that leaned slightly inward as if in counsel. At its center was a stone, smooth and wide, worn flat by time or use. It was unmarked, yet familiar, in the way dreams sometimes are. He stepped into the clearing, and the moment his foot touched the grass, everything stilled. The air thickened, not with heat or fear, but with presence. He was not alone. He didn't see anyone at first, but the feeling was undeniable, like being seen not with eyes, but with understanding. Then, from the edges of the clearing, they appeared. Not many, 3, maybe 4, stepping from between trees as though they had always been part of them. They did not speak. Their faces were gentle, ageless, marked by wind and silence. Their clothes were simple, woven from things the forest offered, patterned in the same natural geometry he'd seen along the path. They regarded him not with surprise or judgment, but with the kind of welcome that only comes from long patience. He stood still, waiting, not out of fear, but to show he knew this moment mattered. The one who stepped forward had kind eyes and hands that had clearly worked both soil and sky. She reached out, not to offer a hand, but to place her palm gently over the center of his chest, right where the hum lived. He did not flinch. Her touch was light, but it felt like it reached through him, like she was listening to something only he had heard, until now. When she withdrew her hand, she nodded, not a greeting, but a confirmation. Then she stepped back. No words were exchanged, and none were needed. He understood. This was the place the hum had always led him toward, and these were the ones who had been waiting, not to change him, not to make him more, but to remind him that he already carried what was needed. He moved to the stone and sat, the earth firm beneath him, the weight in his chest finally quiet. Not gone, but complete. Around him, the others did not encircle or instruct. They simply sat as well, forming not a ring, but a moment, a shared breath. He had not arrived to learn or to serve, but to continue something old in a new shape. The clearing held them like a cradle. No urgency, no ritual, just presence. He didn't know how long they sat there, whether it was minutes or hours, but time had no teeth in that space. It only passed when it was ready. And when at last the wind moved again and the birdsong returned faintly to the trees, he knew something had begun. Not loudly, not all at once, but like roots finding water beneath dry soil, like light touching the edge of sleep, like a life that had been waiting to unfold, finally given permission to bloom. When he rose from the stone, the forest did not shift or speak. It simply accepted his movement with the same calm it had offered his stillness. The others stood as well, quietly, each of them acknowledging the moment not with ceremony, but with presence. Nothing was declared. Nothing needed to be. Something had passed between them, subtle and lasting, like a current beneath still water. And from that point forward, he was no longer walking alone. They did not ask where he had come from, and he did not ask who they were. The answers to those questions already lived in the silence between them. Instead, they walked together, not as strangers, but as those who had always been meant to meet. The path they took wasn't carved into the earth, but revealed itself step by step, shaped by their feet as they moved. It weaved through the trees like a thread pulled gently through fabric, slow and deliberate. He noticed things he hadn't before, the way moss thickened near the roots of certain trees, the pattern of leaves fallen in spirals, the soft hush of wind that seemed to carry not sound but meaning. The forest was not guiding him, it was welcoming him. And in that welcome, he felt himself becoming part of something larger. Not grand, not loud, just whole. They came upon a place deeper in the woods where the canopy opened just enough to let light fall in thin ribbons across the ground. In the center of this clearing there was no stone, no fire, no shrine, just an open circle of flattened earth and a sense of waiting. The others stopped, and so did he. One by one, they stepped to the edge of the circle and touched the earth with their palms before stepping back. He followed without question, his hand pressing into the cool soil. It didn't speak, but it responded, a faint warmth rising into his skin like recognition. When he stood again, the others nodded, not to mark a beginning, but to acknowledge a continuation. They camped that night without speaking much. The fire they lit was small, contained, its flames flickering low but steady. They passed food between them, roots, herbs, bread hard and warm from cloth, and though no blessings were said aloud, everything they did felt like one. He watched them closely, not to learn, but to remember. Their quiet gestures, their still hands, the way they looked at one another without needing to fill the space with noise. These were things he recognized without ever having been taught. Later, as the fire died down and stars opened above them like slow, thoughtful eyes, one of them looked at him, not the first who had touched his chest, but another, older in face and energy. He did not speak, but there was something in his gaze that asked a question. The boy, no, not a boy now, met his eyes and nodded. That was all. Whatever needed to pass between them did so without sound, like water moving between roots. He lay that night on moss, softened by age and rain. The hum within him was no longer a vibration, it was a thread, pulled now and then from somewhere far beyond the forest, reminding him that even here, in this silence, there was motion. In sleep, he dreamed not of the hall or the stars, but of the path behind him, the village, his mother's kitchen, his sister's face at dusk. The dreams did not ask him to return. They only stood still, watching as if to say, "We are part of you, wherever you go." He woke before the others, not from noise, but from the hush itself. The kind of hush that means something is about to happen. He sat up, and the morning air met him with its cool clarity, the kind that belongs only to things that have waited a long time to be seen. He didn't need to ask what came next. It was already here. The path ahead was no longer hidden. It was opening. The others stirred as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, slow and unhurried, as though they had always known this morning would arrive. They rose without words, and he rose with them, his body moving easily into the rhythm of their silence. The fire from the night before had gone out, leaving only a curl of smoke, but no one seemed inclined to rekindle it. Instead, they stepped into the pale air together, the forest parting around them as if it had been waiting for their passage. The path ahead was not marked, yet none of them hesitated. Each step carried the same quiet certainty, a flow as natural as breath. He felt it within himself, too, the sense that he wasn't following them, nor they him, but that all of them were being carried forward by something larger, something woven through roots and stars alike. Every motion belonged to a pattern older than their lives, a pattern he was only beginning to glimpse. They moved until the trees thinned and the land opened into a rise overlooking a stretch of valleys. The view was vast, layered with mist and light, hills rolling into one another like waves, frozen in silence. He had seen horizons before, but never like this. This one felt alive, as though it were breathing, exhaling slowly into the morning sky. He stopped, and so did the others. They let the stillness stretch, their eyes turned outward, not to admire but to remember. One of them, the woman who had touched his chest in the clearing, finally looked at him. Her gaze did not ask a question this time, it gave one. He understood without needing words. This was not just a journey of walking, it was a journey of carrying, of becoming. The valley below was not a destination but a continuation, another layer waiting to be lived. He inhaled, the hum inside him swelling to meet the vastness before him, and exhaled with a steadiness that surprised even himself. He was no longer only receiving, he was beginning to give back. As they descended, the landscape shifted subtly. The trees grew less dense, the air carried scents unfamiliar to him. Wildflowers sharp with dew, earth warmed with a richness deeper than his village fields. Along the way they met no others, but he sensed the presence of lives hidden in the folds of the land, watching without being seen. He didn't feel exposed, he felt acknowledged. The path was widening, not physically, but within him, as if each step expanded the space he carried for the world. That night they stopped by a river whose surface mirrored the stars. Its current was calm but sure, gliding endlessly onward, and as he sat by it, he felt a kinship between the water and himself. Always moving, always carrying, never the same from one breath to the next, yet still whole. The others sat near him, their faces lit by the pale shimmer of starlight. No one spoke, but their silence held him steady, as if reminding him that belonging was not measured in words, but in presence. When he finally slept, the dream returned, not of halls or figures, but of threads stretching across valleys, mountains, oceans. Some glowed faintly, others burned bright, and he realized he was now part of the weave, his own thread moving alongside theirs, crossing, binding, continuing. He woke before dawn with the image still vivid, his chest full, as though the dream had not ended, but flowed on in waking. The river murmured in the early light, and for the first time he felt the hum within him answer it, not as echo but as harmony. He rose with the others, and together they walked again, not toward an ending, but deeper into the unfolding. The days lengthened as they followed the river, its steady current guiding them with a patience that matched their own steps. He began to notice how the land spoke differently here, rocks smoothed by time, reeds bending in patterns that seemed deliberate, the air carrying not only scent, but memory. Each evening, when they stopped to rest, he felt the world folding itself around them, not as a boundary, but as a shelter, a reminder that they were moving through something alive. The hum within him no longer felt like something he carried alone. It resonated now, with the earth beneath his feet, with the trees arching overhead, with the unseen lives that lingered in the silence of the valleys. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he felt the faint impression of voices, not words, but tones, low and distant, as if a great chorus waited just beyond the edge of hearing. They did not summon him, they accompanied him. One evening, as dusk spread violet across the horizon, they reached a place where the river widened into a still pool. The water there reflected the sky so perfectly that the world seemed doubled, above and below, stars waiting to be born. The others stopped, and so did he, sensing that this was not a place to pass through, but to remain for a while. They gathered at the water's edge, sitting without speaking, letting the quiet ripple outward. He leaned forward and touched the surface, watching the rings expand and scatter the mirrored sky. For a moment he felt a surge of unease, as though he had disturbed something sacred. But then the ripples settled, and in their calm he saw not disruption, but continuation, the stars returning, unchanged, as if to remind him that even movement was part of stillness. He understood then that what he carried within him was not meant to resist the world, but to move with it, to join its currents without losing his shape. That night he dreamed of the village again. He saw his sister walking through familiar lanes, her head held high though her eyes searched every horizon. He felt her absence of him not as sorrow, but as strength, a tether she carried quietly in her chest. She had not forgotten, and she did not let go. When he woke, the dream lingered, leaving his chest aching with both longing and peace. He whispered her name into the morning air, and the river seemed to carry it away, as though delivering it back to her. The days after the pool deepened his sense of belonging with the others. They did not teach him in words, but in gestures. One showed him how to listen for the subtle cracks in the silence that meant a storm was approaching. Another handed him a bundle of herbs without explanation, and when he tasted them, he felt his breath ease, as though a hidden tension had been released. Each act was small, almost invisible, but each one rooted him further in the truth he was already beginning to live, that he was not here to become something new, but to remember what he had always been. One night, as they sat together beneath a canopy of stars, the eldest among them finally spoke. His voice was quiet, low enough that it might have been mistaken for the rustle of leaves. "You carry it well," he said simply. No title, no explanation. Just those words, offered like a recognition. The boy bowed his head, not in humility but in acceptance. He knew now that what had begun in him was not his alone. It was part of something vast, something that stretched far beyond the reach of his life. As the fire dimmed, he looked into the night sky and felt it differently than he ever had before. The stars no longer seemed distant or unreachable. They seemed near, as if each one leaned closer, patient and steady, bearing witness. He realized then that the path he walked was not about leaving or arriving, but about carrying the hum within him into every place he would ever go. The journey was not toward the stars, it was alongside them. The following morning rose quietly, the kind of dawn that did not rush but unfolded slowly, as though it wanted every breath of light to be noticed. Mist curled over the river, soft and luminous, and the others moved with the same still rhythm they always had, packing, walking, pausing, not because of routine, but because their lives seemed tuned to something more patient than time. He followed, and with every step he felt himself settling further into the cadence of their silence, as if it had always been waiting for him. The landscape shifted as they moved deeper into the valleys. Hills rose on either side, green with growth, the air threaded with scents of moss and stone, warmed by early sun. The markings he had seen earlier in the forest appeared again here, though now they were clearer. Small stacks of stones balanced in impossible ways, spirals drawn into the soil, patterns of twigs woven into the shapes of stars. None of the others acknowledged them aloud, yet he could see in their faces that they too recognized these signs as more than coincidence. This place was not untouched, it was speaking. By midday they stopped at a ridge where the earth dropped away into a wide plain. From above he could see rivers threading through the land like silver veins, glinting beneath the light. The sight stole his breath, not because of its beauty alone, but because he felt it hum in him, the same resonance that had lived in his chest since birth. The others stood in silence beside him, watching, as though the view itself was a reminder, not a revelation. He felt his thoughts return, unbidden, to his sister. He could almost see her standing at the edge of the village, her eyes turned toward some far horizon she could not see, but refused to stop searching. He carried her presence with him like a second pulse, steadying him as he breathed in the vastness below. She was far, but she was not absent. The thread between them had not frayed, it had only stretched. That night, when they settled in a hollow among the rocks, the fire they lit burned brighter than before, though no one fed it more wood than usual. The flames flickered in long arcs, as if stirred by an unseen hand. He sat closest to it, his eyes fixed on the sparks that rose and dissolved into the dark. As he watched, he felt again the sense of being accompanied, of presences near but unseen. The others seemed to feel it too. Their faces were calm, but their stillness deepened, reverent, as though the night itself had entered their circle. When he closed his eyes, the dream came quickly. He saw once more the hall of constellations, though this time it was no longer endless and empty. Threads of light stretched outward in every direction, connecting stars to rivers, forests to voices, his own life to countless others. The cloaked figure was gone, dissolved into the weave, and he understood now that it had never been separate. It had always been part of this. And so was he. He woke with the fire still glowing, the others sitting in silence, watching the flames as if they too had glimpsed the same vision. No words passed between them, but he felt it in their breathing, in their nearness. They knew. The path ahead was no longer a mystery to them, nor to him. It was not about reaching some distant place. It was about living as if the hum within him had always belonged to the world, because it had. The plains stretched before them the next morning, open and vast, the horizon blurred with light. As they began to descend from the ridge, his steps felt neither heavy nor light but certain. He was not walking away from anything anymore. He was walking into the continuation of everything he had ever been. The descent into the plain was steady, each step drawing them from the shelter of hills into an openness that seemed endless. The sky stretched wide above, a pale canvas brushed with drifting clouds, and the land below spread in quiet layers, fields unmarked by plough or fence, rivers glinting like threads of light, distant groves that shifted with wind but kept their secrets. Walking there felt different from the forest. There were no shadows to enclose them, no trees bending in counsel. Here everything was exposed, and yet it did not feel barren. It felt as though the earth itself was watching, vast and awake. He moved with the others, their silence unchanged, but he felt his chest stirring more strongly now. The hum that had lived inside him since birth was no longer subtle. It resonated outward, aligning with the rhythm of the plains, the low whisper of wind, the faint movement of grass, the far-off call of unseen birds. It was not overpowering, but steady, a reminder that what had begun within him was now part of everything he touched. They walked until dusk turned the horizon to gold, and there they paused beside a cluster of standing stones half buried in the earth. They were weathered, their shapes softened by time, yet arranged too deliberately to be chance. He brushed his hand against one and felt warmth where there should have been only cold rock. It thrummed faintly, answering the hum in his chest. The connection startled him, though it did not frighten. The others saw his reaction but said nothing, only lowering their heads slightly, as if acknowledging what had passed. That night, the air was restless. The wind shifted often, rising and falling like breath drawn in anticipation. He lay awake beneath the stars, listening to the unease in the night, and felt it stirring within him too. It was not dread. It was the nearness of something that had been waiting. When sleep finally took him, the dream came not as vision, but as memory. The bird with the broken wing in his childhood, the comfort his presence had brought to a grieving widow, his sister's hand tightening around his when she feared he would drift too far. All of it rose and wove together, not as fragments, but as proof. He was being shown that his gift had never been about what he might become. It had always been about what he had already given. At dawn, when the first light touched the stones, he felt the air shift in finality. The others gathered around him without instruction, forming a quiet circle, their faces solemn but not heavy. He understood then that this place was not chosen by chance. It was a place where the threads of many lives crossed, where silence itself carried memory. He felt the hum grow so strong within him that it seemed to blur the edges of his body, as if he were dissolving into the world around him. He closed his eyes, and for a moment there was no plane, no stones, no others, only light, pulsing and infinite, threads weaving endlessly outward, connecting him to everything. He felt his sister again, not as absence but as nearness, her strength tethering him even across distance. He felt his mother's lullabies, the stillness of nights in the village, the breath of strangers whose hearts had calmed when he walked near. All of it was part of him, and he was part of all of it. When he opened his eyes, the others were still there, silent, watching. Nothing was spoken, yet everything had changed. He knew now that the journey ahead would not be walked for himself alone, but for all who had touched him, and all who would. The plains stretched vast before them, endless and waiting, and he stepped into it with a calm that was no longer borrowed from silence, but born from within. The plain opened wider as they walked, its horizon stretching farther than the eye could hold. Days passed without measure, marked only by the slow arc of the sun and the soft constellations that returned each night. He felt no need to count them. Each day belonged to something larger, and each night folded gently into the next, as if time itself had loosened its grip. The others moved with the same calm, their steps deliberate, their silence carrying a kind of steadiness that required no words. He began to notice the subtle shifts more clearly now. The hum in his chest no longer surged in moments alone. It resonated constantly, low and steady, weaving into the very air he breathed. Sometimes it answered things he had not called. When a child's cry echoed faintly from some distant settlement on the plain, he felt it stir within him, a pulse of tenderness that did not fade until the sound disappeared. When the wind passed over tall grass, bending it in waves, his heartbeat seemed to match its rhythm, as if he was no longer walking beside the world, but inside it. One evening, they came upon a place where the earth bore shallow carvings, circles within circles cut into stone so old it had softened under centuries of rain. The others stopped without discussion, and so did he. They lowered themselves to the ground and waited, their stillness carrying more reverence than any ritual. He followed, sitting within the pattern of stone, and felt immediately that this was not a place made for seeing, but for remembering. The hum inside him deepened until it seemed to draw him downward, as though the stone itself was speaking through his breath. In that moment, memories not his own pressed through him. A boy in another time, holding a bird with a broken wing. A woman singing to the stars in solitude. A child tracing shapes into dust that glowed faintly in the night. Countless lives flickered, not as visions but as echoes, each one carrying the same hum he had carried all his life. It was not his gift alone. It had lived before him and would live after him, passed like a flame from hand to hand, never diminished. When the vision faded, he opened his eyes to find the others watching, their expressions calm but softened with knowing. No one spoke. They didn't need to. He understood now why they had led him here. The hum was not meant to set him apart, but to bind him to those who carried it across ages, to remind him that he was one thread in a weave far larger than his own life. That night, as stars rose in a sky wide enough to hold every silence, he lay awake longer than the others. He thought of his sister again, the thread between them still firm, still glowing faintly within him. He realized now that even if she never walked this path, she was part of it, because she had anchored him when he might have drifted, and in her anchoring she had carried the hum without ever knowing its name. The wind moved softly across the plain, lifting strands of grass, brushing his hair. He felt no urgency, no demand, only the quiet certainty that what had begun in him had always belonged to something endless. The journey was not nearing its end, it was widening, drawing him further into a pattern that had no edge. He closed his eyes at last, letting the hum cradle him, and drifted into a sleep that felt less like rest and more like returning to the place he had always been moving toward. Morning returned with a clarity so sharp it felt like the air itself had been washed clean. The stones where they had rested now glistened faintly with dew, their carved circles catching the light as though they had been freshly drawn. He rose with the others, but something within him was different, less burdened, more attuned. It was as though the echoes he had carried in the night had not faded, but settled into him, woven tightly with his own breath. Every step forward felt like it was being taken not just for himself, but for all those whose threads he had glimpsed. The plain seemed to open further as they continued, its horizon stretching into a softness that refused to end. He did not feel lost in it. Instead, he felt held. The sky was wide, the earth steady beneath his feet, and the hum within him resonated so deeply now that it seemed inseparable from the world itself. When he glanced at the others, he saw it in them too. Not as something they carried separately, but as a rhythm they all shared. Each one was tuned to the same silent song, and together they moved like notes arranged into a melody too vast to be written. As dusk drew near, the land changed again. They came upon a grove where the trees grew in perfect arcs, branches interlacing so seamlessly that the canopy above looked like a woven cloth. Light filtered through in strands, soft and golden, and the ground was covered in moss so thick it hushed even the sound of their steps. The others slowed, and he felt the reason at once. This was not merely another place to rest. This was a place where something waited. They gathered in the center, the grove holding them in its quiet embrace. No fire was lit, yet warmth seemed to linger in the air. He sat with them, his body still, his senses sharpened. For a long while nothing happened, and yet everything did. The silence was not empty, it was filled with presence. He felt it pressing gently around him, patient and expectant, like the figure in the hall who had once extended a hand. But this time there was no figure. There was only the grove, the hum, and the knowing. Without thinking, he placed his palm against the moss, the earth cool and damp beneath his skin. The hum rose instantly, flowing through his arm, into his chest, filling him until he could scarcely breathe. Images came, not of the past now, but of what lay ahead. Fields where children laughed freely, nights where strangers found rest in one another's company, lives softened by small kindnesses that rippled outward endlessly. He saw himself there too, not as someone central, but as someone who carried calm into places where it had been forgotten. He was not being asked to lead nor to conquer, but simply to remain steady, to remind the world of its own gentleness. When the vision ebbed, he lifted his hand slowly, his breath unsteady, but his heart clear. The others were watching him, their faces unreadable but softened, as though they had witnessed the same truth reflected through him. No words were spoken. None were needed. They all understood that something within him had shifted from promise to purpose. That night, he lay awake beneath the woven canopy, the stars hidden from view, but their light still felt. He thought again of his sister, and this time the ache was different. It was not sorrow nor longing, but gratitude. She had been his first tether, the first to hold him steady when he might have drifted too far. Even across distance, she remained part of him, her presence etched into the very hum that guided him now. he whispered into the grove, not to call her back, but to thank her, knowing the words would travel where they needed. The grove stayed silent, but the air seemed to respond, warm against his skin. He closed his eyes and let it carry him into sleep, knowing with quiet certainty that the journey was moving toward its deepest turn. Not an ending, but a return, a place where all the threads he had carried would gather and reveal the shape they had been forming all along. When dawn filtered through the grove, it was not the sharp brilliance of morning, but a softened light, as though the sun itself chose to arrive gently. He rose with the others, the moss still cool beneath his feet, and for a moment he lingered in the stillness, feeling the quiet hold of the place. It had given him something in the night, something wordless yet clear, and now it released him without resistance, like a parent letting go of a child who has grown. Their steps carried them out of the grove and back into the wide plain, but he did not feel the same as when he had entered. The hum in his chest was steadier, no longer something he needed to chase or interpret. It had settled into him as naturally as breath, and with each stride it seemed to guide not only his body but the air around him, the way grass leaned or how shadows stretched. He was not commanding it. He was moving in rhythm with it, as though he and the world had agreed on the same pulse. By midday they reached a rise where the land spread into a stretch of golden fields. The wind rippled across them in waves, and in that motion he saw again the threads from his vision, lines of light woven into every stalk, each one connected, each one carrying its own quiet song. He paused, and so did the others, the moment heavy with meaning that none of them spoke aloud. It was not a revelation but a reminder. This was what he had been walking toward all along, not a destination, but an understanding. That night, as they rested among the fields, the quiet deepened. He lay on the ground, the stalk shifting gently above him, and closed his eyes. This time, no dream of halls or threads came. Instead, he heard voices, distant, layered, countless. They were not speaking words, but their tones carried recognition, as though all those who had come before were whispering through the air, adding their hum to his. He felt himself dissolve into it, not losing who he was, but expanding, as though his life had become one note in a chord too vast to measure. When he woke, the sensation lingered. The fields shimmered faintly in the early light, and for a moment he thought he could see the echoes of those voices still moving among them, not as ghosts, but as presence. The others stood nearby, silent as ever, yet he sensed they felt it too. They had not led him here to find something new. They had led him here to recognize what had always been woven into him. He thought of his sister again, of the way her hand had gripped his before he left, of the fear in her voice when she said he was slipping away. And he realized now that he had not slipped away at all. He had carried her with him every step, just as he carried his mother's songs, the faces of the villagers, the stillness of the clearing, the river, the stone circles, the grove. All of them were threads in the same fabric, and he was only beginning to see how vast it was. The wind moved through the fields in a long, slow breath, and he let it pass through him, steady and sure. He understood now that the journey was not teaching him how to begin. It was teaching him how to return, not to the village alone, but to everything, as someone who could carry the hum outward wherever the path might stretch. The fields stretched on endlessly, their golden sway moving with the wind as though the land itself was breathing. He and the others walked through them without hurry, each step dissolving into the rhythm of the plain. The hum in his chest seemed to echo outward now, carried by the motion of the grass, as if the earth had learned his song and was singing it back to him. He felt no separation between himself, the others, or the world around him. Everything moved in one continuous flow. By late afternoon, the sky deepened, the light turning warm and heavy, and they came upon a rise where the fields fell away into a shallow valley. At its center lay a single tree, old and immense, its branches twisted yet full, its roots breaking through the soil like veins of stone. The sight of it drew them all to stillness. There was no need for words. The tree carried its own gravity, pulling their silence tighter, holding them in place until they began to descend together. When they reached it, he stepped forward, compelled not by curiosity, but by recognition. This tree was not unfamiliar. He had seen it in the edges of his dreams, its canopy vast, its branches like arms holding both shadow and light. He placed his hand against the bark, and the hum within him surged so strongly that it was no longer just a rhythm in his chest, but a resonance that filled the air. He felt it answered by something deep within the tree, a steady pulse that matched his own, as though the two had been waiting for this moment to meet. The others gathered around, but they did not move closer. They stayed in the circle of shade, watching, their stillness an acknowledgement that this part belonged to him alone. The bark was rough beneath his palm, yet the deeper he pressed, the more it softened, as though the tree was yielding to him, recognizing him as much as he recognized it. Images flickered through his mind, not visions this time, but memories layered into the tree itself. Children laughing beneath its branches centuries ago. Storms it had endured, roots clinging fiercely to the soil. Countless lives passing by, touching it, leaving parts of themselves within its rings. It had been waiting, not for him, but for someone who could hear it. He closed his eyes and let the connection deepen. The hum inside him and the pulse of the tree merged, steady, whole. And in that union he felt the shape of his journey. Not a destination, not a promise of answers, but a truth. He was not here to find greatness, nor to uncover secrets hidden in the stars. He was here to remember, to carry forward the quiet strength that had always been part of him, to weave it into the lives of those who would come after. When he finally opened his eyes, dusk had settled, and the tree stood unchanged, silent, but its presence within him remained. The others still watched, their faces calm, their silence deep with understanding. They had brought him here not to reveal something new, but to let him see himself reflected in what had stood long before him and would stand long after. That night they stayed beneath its branches. The air was cool, fragrant with earth, and the stars pierced through the gaps in the canopy like scattered embers. He lay on the ground, his back against one of the roots, and felt its strength steady him even in sleep. For the first time since he had left the village, his dreams did not carry him elsewhere. They stayed rooted in that place, soft and still, as if even the stars had chosen not to move. The night passed in a silence so complete it seemed woven into the air itself, and when dawn finally broke, it did so gently, with a pale light that slid between the branches and laid itself over their resting forms. He stirred awake to the sound of leaves whispering, though no wind moved them. For a long moment he stayed still, listening, uncertain whether the sound came from outside or from within him. It was only when he lifted his head and looked at the tree again that he realized the whispers were not words, but a rhythm, a continuation of the pulse he had felt before, now stretching into the new day. The others rose quietly, as though they too understood that nothing should disturb the space they had entered. Their movements were unhurried, their faces serene, yet their eyes carried a weight, as though they were waiting for him to recognize what had already begun. He felt it too, a subtle shift, a change, not in the world itself, but in the way it held him. The air no longer pressed in with uncertainty. It seemed instead to carry him, light as a current that knew its own path. He stood slowly and placed his hand once more on the trunk of the tree. The bark was cool now, damp with the dew of morning, but the hum beneath it had not faded. It lived on, steady, patient, as if reminding him that it would remain long after he left. He let his hand linger there, not as a farewell, but as an acceptance. The night had given him rest. The morning gave him clarity. He knew now that the journey was not about seeking a single revelation, but about carrying each moment into the next, allowing them to shape him without resistance. When he finally stepped back, the others began to move, and without words they fell into stride together. They walked beyond the valley, the trees' shadow stretching behind them, until the ground rose again, and the fields opened into a landscape that shifted in color with every step. The gold of yesterday gave way to silver grasses that shone like water under the morning light, and in the distance low hills rolled into one another, softened by mist. It felt as though the earth itself was unfolding, showing them new forms without asking them to question or to name. He felt no urge to ask where they were going. The place itself was enough, and each step forward felt inevitable. Yet with that inevitability came a quiet tension, as though the stillness they carried could not remain untouched forever. Beneath the calm ran a current he could not ignore, a subtle warning that this part of the path would bring him closer to something more demanding than before. As they climbed one of the hills, the mist thickened, and for a moment the figures of the others seemed to dissolve around him, shapes fading into pale air. He walked on, trusting their presence even when he could no longer see them, and when the mist finally broke, he found himself standing at the edge of a wide expanse of stone. It stretched out flat and dark, cracked with lines that glowed faintly, as if the ground itself remembered fire. The others reappeared beside him, their outlines steady once more, but none of them stepped forward. They stopped at the boundary where grass gave way to stone, and their silence grew heavier. He felt it then, the weight of expectation pressing not from them, but from the place itself. The lines of light pulsed faintly in time with something deep within him, the same rhythm he had carried from the tree. He understood without being told. The journey had led him here, and what waited within the stone would not be shared. It would demand him alone. The others had brought him this far, but the next steps were his to take, and he felt the quiet certainty that whatever was bound into that glowing earth was already tied to the hum within his chest. He drew in a breath, steady, unafraid, but deeply aware, and placed his foot onto the stone. The faint glow brightened under his step, and the pulse grew stronger, matching the beat of his heart. Behind him, the others remained at the edge, watching, their silence both farewell and trust. Ahead, the expanse of stone stretched endlessly, waiting to show him what it held. His first steps across the stone felt uncertain, though the surface beneath his feet was solid and unyielding. The faint glow followed him, spreading outward with each movement like ripples on dark water, and though no sound accompanied it, the silence itself seemed sharpened, attentive. He could feel the others still watching from the edge, though he dared not turn back. The weight of their trust held him upright, even as the vast expanse before him seemed endless. The air here was different, thinner yet charged, as if each breath carried traces of something ancient. He pressed forward, each step sinking with the rhythm beneath the stone, his own heartbeat no longer his alone. The glow along the cracks thickened as he walked, lines spreading farther, illuminating a path that had not existed moments before. He realized then that the stone was not merely ground, but a living surface, aware of him, shaping itself to his presence. A tension began to build within his chest. It was not fear exactly, nor pain, but a pressure that demanded endurance. With every step forward, the sensation deepened, as though the very place was measuring him, testing not his strength, but his willingness to continue. He steadied his breath, reminding himself that this was why he had come, not for certainty, but for the trial itself. Time seemed to bend as he walked. The expanse stretched without end, yet, with each pulse of light, he sensed he was nearing something inevitable. His mind drifted between clarity and haze, memories rising unbidden, faces of those who had walked beside him, moments of silence by the tree, the weight of nights filled with waiting. They passed before him like echoes, not to distract, but to remind him of what he carried. Then, slowly, the horizon shifted. The glowing cracks converged ahead, drawing him toward a single point where the stone lifted, forming a low rise that glowed brighter than the rest. At its center, a fissure yawned open, wide enough for him to see that it descended into darkness. The light pooled around its edges, but nothing revealed what lay below. He stopped at the brink, the hum within him loud now, filling his body until it was impossible to tell whether it came from the earth or from his own blood. For a long moment he only stood there, staring down into the hollow, waiting for the place itself to tell him what must be done. No voice came, no sign appeared. Only the unbroken silence of the glowing stone and the pulse that demanded he choose. He knew then that the journey had narrowed to this. There would be no path revealed until he stepped into the unknown. Behind him, the others had vanished into mist once more, their presence no longer within reach. It was not abandonment, but inevitability. This part belonged to him alone. He drew in one final steadying breath and let it fill him completely. Then, without hesitation, he leaned forward and stepped into the fissure. The stone gave way, and the light around him flared, swallowing the last of the surface above. Darkness rose up to meet him, vast and silent, carrying him into whatever waited below. The fall was not like falling through air, but through silence itself, thick and weightless, pulling him deeper with no measure of distance. There was no sense of rushing downward. Instead, the darkness folded around him, drawing him inward, as though he were being carried along by something unseen. For a moment he feared he would never land, that he would dissolve into the void entirely, until his feet touched ground so softly it was as if the earth had been waiting for him. He opened his eyes, though he was not certain he had closed them, and found himself in a vast hollow. The walls around him shimmered faintly, veined with the same pale light that had guided him above, but here the glow was muted, as if cautious. The air was colder, sharper, and it carried with it a hum too low to be heard fully, yet impossible to ignore. Each breath he drew filled him with an awareness that he was no longer alone, though nothing stirred in the hollow's expanse. As he stepped forward, the ground beneath his feet rippled faintly, light chasing his movement like threads weaving themselves together. The sensation reminded him of the path above, but here the light did not lead. It followed. He realized that whatever governed this place was no longer testing him. It was responding to him, echoing his choices, awaiting the shape of his intent. The silence thickened as he walked, until he reached the hollow's center. There, a structure rose from the stone, a pillar, rough and ancient, carved not by hands but by time itself. Its surface was inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift when he tried to focus, never holding their form long enough to be named. The pillar pulsed faintly, each beat aligned with the rhythm that still thrummed within his chest. He reached out without meaning to, his hand drawn toward the stone. The instant his fingers brushed its surface, a rush of light coursed outward, flooding the chamber and splitting the silence. The symbols flared, rearranging themselves into a pattern that held, steady and unchanging. The hum within him answered, and for the first time he understood. It was not the earth alone, but something older, something waiting for recognition. The ground trembled softly, not with threat, but with awakening. The pillar began to shift, its surface cracking open to reveal a hollow core that glowed with a light so deep it seemed to carry weight. He felt it draw him closer, not as command, but as invitation, and he knew instinctively that this was the threshold he had been moving toward since the beginning. The air grew heavier around him, pressing against his skin, urging him to decide. He could turn away, remain within the safety of the chamber, let the light close again and bury its secrets, but the thought passed quickly, hollow and untrue. Every step that had carried him here, every silence endured, every unseen hand that had shaped his path had led to this single choice. With steady breath, he placed both hands upon the opening and leaned forward, letting the glow spill into him. The chamber responded in kind, the light flaring brighter, the hum rising until it was no longer a sound, but a presence filling every part of him. The pillar dissolved around him, and once again the ground gave way, not as collapse but as passage, drawing him into the heart of what lay beyond. The pull of the light did not tear at him as the fall had before. It enfolded him, steady and deliberate, carrying him deeper into its current. He felt as though he were passing through layers of silence, each one denser than the last, until sound itself became memory, and only the rhythm within his chest kept him tethered. Then, without warning, the weight lifted, and he found himself standing once more upon solid ground. This time the space was not hollow but vast, a chamber shaped like a cathedral carved from living stone. Its ceiling soared into darkness, but its walls gleamed faintly with lines of light that ran like veins through the rock. At the chamber's center rose a circle of monoliths, their surfaces etched with the same shifting script he had glimpsed before. Unlike the pillar, these were steady, their symbols fixed, as if they had been waiting for centuries for his arrival. The air vibrated, the hum rising now into something almost like a voice. It was not language, yet it pressed against his thoughts with the weight of meaning, urging him forward. Each step he took between the monoliths made the light grow sharper, the rhythm in his chest matching their pulse, as if he were no longer walking alone, but as part of a vast, unseen design. When he reached the center of the circle, the ground flared alive beneath him, a sigil spreading outward in patterns too intricate for the eye to follow. The monoliths answered in unison, their glow converging into a single beam of light that fell upon him. He staggered under its force, not because it sought to crush him, but because it revealed the truth of what had always lingered in shadow. Memories that were not his own rushed through him, glimpses of ages long buried, of hands carving these stones, of voices sealing their power away. He saw the rise and fall of countless lives bound by the same silence that had guided him here. The vision did not stop with the past. It reached forward, showing paths not yet walked, choices that stretched outward like branches. Some glimmered faint and fragile, others burned bright and violent. All of them curved back to the chamber, back to this moment, as though the circle of stone was not a relic, but a hinge upon which time itself had turned. The beam dimmed, releasing him, though its weight lingered in his chest. He sank to one knee, breathless, the hum inside him now loud enough to shake the chamber. The monoliths pulsed once more, and for the first time he understood their silence was not absence, it was expectation. They had been waiting not for any wanderer, but for him, and now the choice they offered could no longer be delayed. He rose slowly, his hand brushing the sigil still glowing faintly beneath his feet. The air grew still as though the chamber itself held its breath. The hum pressed close, patient yet insistent, demanding not escape but decision. He knew that whatever he chose here would not only bind his path but reshape all that followed, the threads of past and future converging upon this single point. And as the silence deepened once more, he felt the weight of eyes unseen, ancient, unblinking, waiting for the answer he could no longer postpone. The silence stretched so long it felt like it might consume him, but within that stillness his heartbeat thundered, steady and deliberate, echoing the rhythm that had carried him through every descent. The circle of monoliths glowed faintly, their light no longer oppressive, but watchful, like 100 unspoken questions waiting on his lips. He closed his eyes, steadying the tremor in his breath, and felt the weight of choice pressing closer. It was not a single decision laid out before him, but a weaving of paths, each one leading toward an end he could not fully see, yet all demanding something of him that could never be returned once given. The ground beneath him shifted not violently, but with the subtle certainty of gears sliding into place. The sigil that had flared to life beneath his feet began to change, its intricate lines rearranging into new forms. He realized the chamber was not merely a place of revelation. It was a mechanism, ancient and exacting, one that required his assent before it could move forward. The hum in the air deepened, resonating with his chest until he could no longer tell where his body ended and the silence began. For a moment he considered retreat, but there was no longer any way back. The beam that had shown him fragments of past and future had bound him too tightly. His steps had already been marked in this pattern long before he entered the chamber. The monoliths pulsed again, more insistent this time, as though the waiting eyes around him grew restless. He raised his hand, hesitating, then placed it upon one of the stones. A jolt surged through him, not pain, but a current so raw it stripped away pretense. In that instant he felt his own life laid bare, every choice he had made, every hesitation, every regret coiled like threads around his being. They shimmered in the light, fragile yet unbreakable, weaving into the great design that stretched far beyond him. He saw how little and how much he mattered all at once, a single point on a map too vast to comprehend. The monolith drank in his touch, its symbols flaring brighter, and then the others joined, one by one, until the circle burned like a crown of fire around him. The chamber shuddered, dust raining from the unseen ceiling, and the sigil beneath him surged upward, lifting him slowly from the ground. Suspended in the center of light, he felt both anchored and unmoored, caught in the hinge between what had been and what was to come. A final pulse tore through the silence, sharp and absolute, and for the first time the hum gave way to a voice. It was not loud, but it filled every corner of him, resonant and undeniable. The path is chosen. His breath caught as the light folded inward, not vanishing, but sinking into him, burning into his chest, until the sigil there flared to life. The monoliths dimmed, their long vigil complete, leaving the chamber in a half-light that felt emptier than before. He lowered gently to the ground, his body trembling, his vision still filled with after-images of fire and stone. The silence returned, but it was no longer expectant. It was final, the kind of silence that follows when a threshold has been crossed. He stood unsteadily, knowing that whatever lay beyond the chamber's walls would no longer be the same world he had entered from. And yet, even as fear curled cold within him, the rhythm in his chest steadied, guiding him forward into the waiting dark.